Hello, welcome back to Learning Curves. I'm Anastasia, and today's an exciting one, you guys. This is a life skill. Keep it in your pocket, use it to fix your pocket when it gets a hole. We are going to learn an invaluable hand sewing stitch to have in your arsenal. In last week's video, we made a hand warmer, filled it with rice, and we are going to learn how to hand stitch that closed. I get asked to fix a lot of stuff from loved ones, and this is the stitch I use. It goes by a lot of names. I think most often it's called a slip stitch. I've also heard it called invisible whip stitch, tunnel stitch, lots of stitch names. This stitch is best used on a seam. I mean, anytime you stitch two things together, that is a seam, but when something is ripped, torn, broken in the middle of the fabric, this is not the best. You could totally use this stitch. You're just gonna end up with kind of like a Frankenstein situation. This is more to close up a project by hand or when there is a ripped seam. So today, the example I'm going to have for that is I'm fixing up a stuffed animal. Also, I wanna be clear, let's not be snobs about this. I'm sure you'd never. But there are so many ways to start stitching, to stop stitching, and to stitch. We're not talking right way, wrong way, but this is my personal favorite combination. So I'm gonna teach you those. Let's do it! Supplies. First, you'll need a needle. Needles come in all different shapes and sizes. It's usually personal preference on the length of needle, eye of needle, etc. Then you'll need a pair of scissors. Really, anything works. Your desired thread. You'll likely want something sturdy, and be mindful of material, you know, synthetic versus natural fiber. If you're completing the hand warmer project, synthetic could melt. And pins. Probably. This is kind of a dealer's choice. I think starting out using pins is helpful. The first thing you'll do is cut a length of thread that's like 4 times the length of what you're gonna need to stitch. If you don't have enough thread, then you'll just use the techniques we're talking about in this video to stop and restart. If you have too much thread, sometimes that can get in the way. Feel it out. Once you learn this stitch, you're gonna be using it everywhere, so you'll get a lot of practice. Feed one end of the thread through the eye of the needle and pull it back down to meet the other end of the thread so that the thread is now doubled with the needle kind of stuck on the thread. You'll knot the thread at the end, just a single knot, so that the needle cannot fall off. It's not the size of the knot here, we just need the knot to be structurally sound, to not fall out. Okay, now we're gonna do our starting stitch to lock the thread into the project. In this project, this is the hand warmer. It's filled with rice, so I have a pin in the middle of the project to kind of hold that rice in place. So starting somewhere in the seam allowance on either the right side or the wrong side, whichever you prefer, bring your needle down into the fabric and then back up very close by. If it's a woven material, this is just a few threads away. And then as you're pulling your thread, feed your needle back through the 2 strands on the knotted end and then pull taut. So this will lock that thread in place. So you can see here that our knot is not to keep just that end from going through the fabric. It's just to make a loop with that thread, and that locks that starting stitch into place. So we're gonna look at this again on a couple other projects, but first let's get this needle into our starting stitching position. So we need to feed the needle through inside the project so that it comes up very near our seam and past where the thread is secure. So here, that's gonna be inside of the back stitching. So if this is a project that you're finishing, the thread is secure where you have backstitched, right? So you want to come up inside of that, so you're just continuing that security through as you're stitching your seam. If this is a repair job, you'll want to get your needle up near where the threads are still sewn together. Here, I'm getting the needle into starting position by just turning the top part inside out again so you can see better. Feel free to do that. You'll just turn it right side out before you continue stitching. I don't usually do that. I usually just feed the needle through by feel. And ideally, you'll bring your needle up on the same side of the project where we knotted, the same side of the seam. This isn't super important, but it can help it like lie better at the end. Just trust me. Okay, now we're gonna look at the same thing on a scrap piece of felt. The starting lock stitch that we're making is so small that you hardly see it from the other side. We were really doing it in the seam allowance just because we have access to it and it's more hidden there, but if you didn't do it there, whatever. Sometimes the threads get uneven, just gently tug around until they even back out again. This is one thing that can get super annoying and frustrating if the length of the thread you cut is super long. This is less of a problem with shorter thread lengths. Stuff doesn't get tangled. You can see here that the starting lock stitch we're making is so small you can hardly see it from the other side. In fact, it's about the same size as this fleck of who knows what on the other side of this fabric. Now we're gonna look at this on a stuffed elephant that I'm repairing. So here it's pretty hard to see. I'm using a complementary color and there's fluff. So on a furry material like this, it's hard to tell what is and isn't seam allowance. It's hard to tell kind of where your thread is. It's hard to match things up. All of that is actually great because it can be way more forgiving. You're not really going to see as much of that in the final product, but it's also frustrating to my Virgo soul because it's harder to make perfect, which is a good exercise in, you know, acceptance, serenity, all that, right? Now let's learn the actual stitch. So our thread's coming up on one side of the seam. Push your needle down into the fabric directly on the other side of the seam, and then pointing your needle in the direction that we're sewing, feed your needle inside of the seam allowance fold a little ways, and then come up on the same side of the seam right at your stitch line, and repeat this until you get to the other side of your seam where the stitching is already secure again, like past your back stitching or past where the seam has torn, depending on if you're repairing or doing a new project. It is important that your needle is pointing in the direction that you're traveling. For me, as a right-hander, I like to have the opening to my left so that my needle is pointing towards the left and traveling towards the left. I find that to be a lot easier. The whole thing about this stitch is that you want your needle to come up and down right next to each other on either side of the seam and do your traveling inside of the fold of the seam allowance. This fold is what puts the tunnel in tunnel stitch, and how far your needle travels in the fold decides your stitch length. So if making tiny stitches is too difficult to do, then just stitch in one direction best you can and then turn around and do the same stitch coming back the other direction, but make sure that you make your stitches between your previous stitches, effectively cutting your stitch length in half. Does that make sense? So I want to make another note about thread length here. If one of the threads that we're stitching were to get cut, the entire seam would bust open. We're not making like additional knots in here. So if you're using a shorter thread, or if you do stitch in one direction and then stitch back the other direction, that's going to help secure your project. You're stitching it twice, right? So if one direction of thread gets snipped, you still have the threads going in the other direction. Or if your thread isn't long enough, then you make the stopping stitch in the middle, then that effectively secures that chunk. So if that chunk gets ripped, the next chunk will still stay secure, and vice versa. So sometimes I'll throw the closing stitch in the middle. Even though I keep going, I just don't cut the thread, I just keep going. But you don't have to do that. I mean, it's just really just on high wear and tear seams or really long seams that I'll throw an extra like closing locking stitch in there. I'm going to show you what this looks like on the scrap piece of felt. Even though there isn't a seam, I'll just show you what the stitches look like. Okay, I'm going to show you what this looks like on the elephant, but honestly, you can't tell what I'm doing. I was doing it and I couldn't tell what I was doing. But here it is. Now to end. Much like the beginning, we will make a tiny stitch and knot without tying a separate knot. But we'll do this by bringing our needle down very close to our last stitch, only a few threads apart on the same side of the seam, and then you'll come back up right next to or at that previous stitch, effectively forming a loop. And then you'll pull your needle through the loop that you formed and then pull it tight, and that forms your knot. So we make our last stitch, our thread's coming up, we bring our needle down very close to where that thread's coming up, and then come right back up where that thread did come up, forming a loop. If that, you don't have to worry about coming directly up in that same spot, just be close to it. If you're not bringing your needle up exactly at that same spot where the previous stitch was, then I feed my needle through from around the other side, if that makes sense. It really doesn't matter. If you're just kind of close on all of this, it's going to be fine. You're kind of just tangling the thread. And then I will often do this twice, right in the same spot. And sometimes if I'm paranoid, I'll do another one close by. If you can squeeze this somewhere inconspicuous, like after you do your last stitch coming up next to the seam, you like go back down and like feed your needle through to the seam allowance if you have some space there. Cool. If not, whatevs. It's a pretty inconspicuous knot, so if you can put it somewhere even more inconspicuous, spectacular. If not, cool. And then after you've made that knot, we'll hide our end and cut the thread. We'll do this by feeding our needle into the project, just anywhere. It really doesn't matter. You'll just want to travel through the project, and you'll pull the thread taut so that the fabric bunches up a little bit. You don't need to go crazy on this. You just want the thread to be a little shorter than the distance it's traveling. And then you'll snip the thread, and then the cut ends of the thread will disappear into our project. Sometimes there's a quilting knot I like to use at the end of projects. So that one takes a little more finesse, and I think this ending stitch is so much easier and more versatile. So this is my preferred method in these cases. And that is it! Congratulations! You are currently a graduate of Anastasia's Sewing 101 Made Up course online. Everything's made up though. You know it's not made up? How much I like you. There are other beginner sewing videos that you think belong in this series that I have not provided. please let me know. I would love nothing more, a few things more maybe, but very few things more than to make those videos for you. So please let me know. You guys, next week's a little bit uncharted territory, right? Like I didn't post videos for 2 years, came back on here, did this Sewing 101 series, and now I have so much content that I shot during that 2-year break from posting that I'm gonna post some of those. Some of that's gonna have sewing content and some of it's not. We're gonna talk about this room. I skim coated and painted this room. I'm gonna talk about what I learned as a beginning skim coater. I tried 3 different methods for painting. We're gonna talk about those at some point. If you like this video, please like this video, and I'll see you next time. Bye.